Ever since the introduction of Mythic Plus and Legion, Blizzard has increased its difficulty with a system called Affixes. These Affixes are constant passive throughout the entire dungeon that all have different effects on a weekly rotation. In this video, we're going to be going over the worst Mythic Plus Affixes to have ever existed in WoW. Starting us off at number 10, we have the Tyrannical Affix. Tyrannical is super simple, and in modern WoW, it will give all the bosses of a dungeon 30% more HP, on top of an already scaling keystone level. Additionally, the bosses will do an extra 15% damage flat out. It is applied to every single keystone, no matter the level, and only changes depending on the week. Its counter being Fortified, which has the opposite effects, and instead buffs the trash mobs of the entire instance. However, Tyrannical has a higher count for messing up keys, because when you start to reach the higher levels, if you wipe even once or twice on a Tyrannical boss, it may cost you the entire key, and you will not be able to time it. This is because the boss fights are just so much longer than usual, and you can get a boss nearly dead in wipe, losing possibly 4 or more minutes on that key. It's a lot easier to pull trash and make mistakes because you can just resurrect at any point and pick up where you left off. But with bosses, this ability is removed entirely. If you're locked in combat with a boss, you have to defeat it or wipe in order to bring back your party members. Most Mythic Plus routes also adjust Bloodlust timings around the boss. So if you were to pull a boss and use less, you'd incur the 10-minute cooldown regardless if the boss died or not. Because of this, wiping is just much more punishing than with the typical wipes, as Bloodlust is one of the strongest cooldowns in a coordinated mythic group. It also depends on the type of dungeon you're doing as well. In a dungeon, like Halls of Infusion Tyrannical, you could be fighting the Primal Tsunami boss for almost literally 10 minutes depending on how high your keystone is. The mechanic of it lifting you, throwing you up into the back of the room, and forcing you to run a gauntlet wastes so much time. Whereas other bosses may just be a standing and hitting simulator. This isn't to say that standing and hitting bosses can't be hard either. The Soulbound Goliath in the Waycrest Manor has a ramping damage mechanic in the form of Soul Harvest. This mechanic is insanely risky to allow at high stacks, as it may just flat out one-shot your tank from the melee hit to the boss on Tyrannical Wings. But also, if you choose to burn the boss to remove its stacks, the following AoE cast it creates also is just absolutely going to shred your group if you aren't careful. Generally, very few people actually enjoy the addition of Tyrannical, whereas Fortified allows for players to do some crazy AoE pulls and just do massive amounts of damage. Tyrannical definitely slows down keys, and when the goal is to go as fast as you possibly can, the idea that a single wipe can ruin your entire run is generally pretty annoying to deal with. Couple this with the fact that some classes are just weaker than others, such as Hunters, and if they get a target with a certain mechanic from a boss, they may just flat out die on the spot without external help. What's actually crazier is the current version of Tyrannical is a slightly nerfed version of its original rendition in Legion. Back in Legion, it used to increase bosses' HP by 40% rather than 30%, simply meaning every single boss you're fighting now would have had another 10% health to deal with if this nerf was never made. Generally, no one really enjoys feeling like their keys are just going to come to a grinding halt, and don't enjoy fighting a boss for an extended period of time. But because this affix is literally around 50% of the time, it's just something players have to deal with, and it only finds itself at number 10 to start. And at number 9, we have Necrotic. What Necrotic does is every time a mob in the keystone would melee you, it would apply a stacking debuff. This debuff would deal a moderate amount of damage over time to its target, and also reduce their healing received. This affix is solely designed around just completely ruining a tank's day, with the exception of mobs that fixate and cannot be taunted, thus applying the debuff to non-tanks, since the debuff is only applied on melee hits. It's safe to assume only your tank should be getting the debuff in the process. Upon its inception, the debuff would deal plague damage, thus ignoring armor, because it was magic damage. Additionally, for every stack, it reduced healing by 3%. So at around 30 melee hits on your tank, they would have 90% reduced healing. In order to counter this affix, tanks would be forced to run in groups, build as much aggro as possible, and when the stacks in Necrotic began to become lethal, they would need to run away and kite the pack to allow the stacks to reset, all while taking damage from the dot itself. It was an incredibly boring way to tank, as most tank players want to be in the pack and contributing, not running away, cowering, and barely being able to survive. This was especially frustrating to deal with for classes such as Blood Death Knights, which completely rely on the healing for Deathstrike in order to actually stay alive and tank. With the debuff just naturally nerfing their classes for performing their role, it was a pretty big upset. Death Knights are also one of the slower classes compared to the other tanks, so even when they make the attempt to kite the mobs to drop their stacks, they might just die in the process, if they didn't get the talent Grip of the Dead. It was actually very common to see tank players roll to Dwarf or Dark Iron Dwarf to receive their racial ability Stoneform and Fireblood. These were the only dispels in the entire game that were capable of removing the Necrotic debuff, so if a tank got super high stacks, they could use their racial to just flat out remove all of them and not need to kite at all. Following patch 7.2 of Legion would begin a lengthy process of Blizzard attempting to balance this affix to be more enjoyable and counterable for the tank players involved, starting with allowing the stacks to drop off when exiting combat and reduce its duration to 9 seconds instead of 10. The release of BFA would change the healing reduction to 2% instead of 3% per stack, just flat out letting the tank survive more and allow higher stacks. In patch 8.1, the debuff was changed to now apply a physical damage debuff, allowing the armor of the tanks to be more useful and take more of the damage passively. Patch 9.1 of Shadowlands made it where trash mobs now apply necrotic stacks half as frequently, meaning every other hit of the mob will apply the debuff rather than every single hit. So for about 2 whole expansions, it existed in a state where every melee would apply the stacks and just ruin a tank's morale at the start of a pull. Bosses, however, would continue to apply the debuff at the same rate. Bosses were generally never a big issue. However, for many cases with this affix, unless they summoned waves of adds that would melee the tank, as bosses don't swing very often at the tank themselves, and there are breaks where the boss must complete their own various mechanics, allowing the debuff to drop off. Patch 9.1.5 lowers the debuff duration to 6 seconds from 9, and patch 9.2 lowered it from 5 to 6. You can see that Blizzard was attempting to have possible ways tank could just drop the debuff, while they were still fighting a pack without the need to kite. Even if that wasn't possible though, you could kite the trash packs and let the stacks drop off, and then get back to tanking much quicker with the debuff reduction. Finally, at the release of Dragonflight, this affix was removed altogether, as Blizzard realized there was no world where kiting mobs and trying to fight a healing debuff on tanks that existed so passively was super unfun. Necrotic never really changed how a key was run, other than just slowing it down by ruining the tank's fun, so it finds itself at number 9 and not any higher, mostly for just being a big you suck button for tanks and tanks alone. And at number 8 we have Inspiring, added at the beginning of Shadowlands. What this affix did was it would have a fixed set of mobs in every dungeon that would have the Inspiring effect applied to them. What this did was allow all mobs surrounding the Inspired one to be completely immune to any form of crowd control or interrupts. The mob giving off the Inspired buff itself can, however, be controlled still. Basically, you could pull a pack, and if there was an Inspired mob, nothing could be slowed down, and you either needed to nuke the Inspired mob down as fast as you possibly can, or hard CC it and pull the pack away from it. Things like a Demon Hunter's Imprison, a Hunter's Freezing Trap, or a Mind Control from a Priest were optimal ways to avoid this affix's side effects. If you didn't have any sort of option to handle the Inspiring mob, you were likely in for a really rough time, as not being able to stop important casts with a crowd control was a very detrimental thing to your group. There was also the complication that things like the previously mentioned Imprison only work on certain mob types. For the time it existed in Shadowlands, a very large majority of mobs were undead, meaning there were very few ways to actually hard CC the mob before engaging. While it may have given hunters an excellent utility mythic plus, it's never fun to make a class just flat out required to enter a dungeon and have a hope of timing it. As opposed to Necrotic, this affix would affect an entire group's method of play, and change the route so you could altogether just avoid mobs with Inspiring when possible. Where this affix really shows was with pug groups, however, as you'd almost always have that one guy just face pull the Inspiring mob and ruin your chances of CCing it early, and possibly causing it to wipe your group. Plus, you might not even have a class able to handle the CC altogether. So generally, it was just unfun to literally have to just watch the spells you're supposed to counter go off. But Blizzard seemed to take this criticism seriously, as the affix was completely removed from the game at the start of Dragonflight, lasting only one expansion, without attempts to balance it or make it more enjoyable. And at number 7, we have Quaking. Added in Legion when Mythic Plus itself was, Quaking was a mechanic that would occasionally trigger a brownish circle to form under the feet of every player currently alive in the dungeon. When the debuff of the circle ends, anyone who was standing in your circle will take a high amount of damage that scales depending on your keystone level. Additionally, it will interrupt any spell casting if anyone is hit. The interrupt effect would still occur, however, if you were casting and didn't hit anyone with your circle. So when the Quaking cast starts, you'd need to finish your current cast or just wait for it to end so you don't risk even further downtime by interrupting yourself. Quaking was generally a spread and watch out mechanic, just making sure your group is paying attention to their general surroundings. Occasionally, this spread to make people not wanting to hit each other could pull extra mobs into your pack, possibly causing some deaths in your group. Next to this, the damage could almost one-shot you. if you happen to be hit by 2 players quaking circles. You could assume you're safe, and then at the last second, a player moves towards you and then hits you with their circle, and you take unaccounted for damage because you were originally safe. The worst part was when bosses had unique mechanics that would grip players together, causing super inconvenient timings where the boss would just pull the group together and a last second quaking would go off and kill almost everyone at once. And there was very little counterplay when this occurred, as it was just simply the luck of the draw, often forcing Blizzard to intervene themselves to have quaking not cast at all during certain bosses' mechanics. This is primarily seen with the final boss of the Nakun offensive, when the boss would cast Static Spear and at its peak it will grip every player, potentially killing them due to quaking, and not even the mechanic's damage itself. This isn't even to consider the dungeons where space is very cramped. The most recent example of this was Grimroll Depot when it was made into a Mythic Plus dungeon in Shadowlands Season 4. This space was very minimal, and with the incredibly awkward camera angles, it could be super frustrating trying to see where you and others are to try and avoid hitting each other with quaking. This effects remained basically the exact same through the mini expansions it existed, dealing some damage to and interrupting you if you were casting during its completion. It wasn't until Dragonflight Season 2 this affix was officially retired by Blizzard, likely to not make a comeback. Overall, not fun and just a big hindrance to the group with no counterplay, outside of staying away from people trying to help you. Near the midpoint is Explosive at number 6. Explosive was a level 7 affix that would spawn orbs when in combat, depending on how many mobs you were currently fighting. These orbs could not be hit by AoE attacks, so you were required to hard target them and hit them with a light attack to kill them, as they had very little health, but just enough that any normal healer couldn't just hit them for DPS unless they had unusually high DPS. If these orbs failed to be destroyed in time, they would explode, as the affix name suggests, and deal high damage to the group. As mentioned, more of these orbs would spawn depending on your current number of mobs in combat, so fighting more would just cause even more of these orbs to spawn that must be handled to avoid a wipe. To be precise, the orb would deal 40% of your health in a 60-yard radius, so just 2 of these going off is nearly all of your HP. Coupled with the fact that you're actively fighting mobs already, it was probably just going to kill you. You have around 5 to 6 seconds for each orb before they detonate, so it was likely you'd assigned one person to deal with explosives, likely a ranged DPS. Obviously though, not everyone can have this ease of access, and it was super annoying to have to try and tab to click the correct orb in a high density pool, as target macros would not work for you. So once again, some classes were simply better at the affix than others, and it put many people at disadvantage simply for existing as the class. It also generally put a hiccup in players' rotations, as you would need to hard target the orb and hit it with some sort of ability, and not whatever was part of your AoE rotation. Melee were quite good at this, but something like a Demonology Warlock was super frustrating, because they're a ramping class, and telling their horde of demons to swap to a mob with little health would complicate things. This isn't even to account for the fact that if you lose a player to a death, the amount of explosives won't slow down, making it even harder to recover from the loss of more orbs coming around. It was never a key breaker, but it was safe to assume that when explosive was in rotation for the week, you'd grow in annoyance, especially if you run a pug, where DPS players don't like having extra responsibility. So it finds itself at number 6 for just generally being annoying, due to the fact that things could go wrong almost instantly, but also not insanely hard to counter if your group is aware of what is happening. And at number 5, we have the first seasonal affix of Dragonflight, Thundering. Thundering would just flat out give all enemies in the Keystone a 5% more health. When you were in combat, you would periodically be overcharged with the power of the Storm of Razagath. Failure to discharge it would stun you and deal some damage. To put it in simpler terms, every 60 seconds while in combat, every player would receive a mark of lightning or wind. These marks increase your damage by 30% and make you immune to roots and slows for 15 seconds. If the marks expire while another player has the opposite mark as you still, it will donate your damage to you and stun you for 5 seconds. If you run your character through another character with the opposite mark, it will remove yours and your opposing players and avoid the stun. Once marked with the Thundering buff anyways, it was pretty difficult to actually tell who had which mark. Very often, players needed external add-ons like weak ores to tell them which mark they had and how long they had, to maximize the damage increase of the buff. Without the external help, Blizzard was assuming you would just count the seconds of the buff in your head or something, in order to not lose your damage. Any mechanic that forces you to use something external from the game is never a good addition to the game, and without the many add-ons or weak ores, it made handling this affix much more frustrating because of the visual clutter it makes. The difference between the lightning and wind marks was very similar in color, and was pretty faded in opacity, so sometimes you might just accidentally run into the wrong person and think you cleared your debuff, or not be able to find them in time, stunning a quarter of your group. About 2 months into this run, Blizzard made the change that tanks would always get Mark of the Wind. because what would often happen is a tank would go to clear the buff to prevent being stunned and accidentally hit the entire group with mechanics intended just for the tank to be hit by. With this change, it made timing easier to understand and allowed for groups to know who could safely run to the tank when the mechanic goes off. Now, as seasonal affixes go, this was Blizzard's attempt to create an affix that doesn't change routes drastically. It was just something that could exist throughout dungeons. This was because Blizzard was beginning to experiment with using past expansions dungeons, and they aren't all designed to work with affixes like these in mind. Needless to say, they realized this method isn't going to work for the new strategy of Mythic Plus seasons, as seasonal affixes were retired altogether after Thundering. This was because the affix was just an incredibly annoying side job on top of the other various affixes and dungeons mechanics themselves, and without the addition of weak ores, it may have been even worse trying to handle it. Thankfully, if you had a really coordinated group, this affix was almost nothing to you. But the fact that it was just something to almost entirely ignore doesn't favor it at all, so it finds itself in the middle of our list. And at number 4, we have Prideful. This was a seasonal affix of Shadowlands Season 1 and was applied to every keystone at level 10 or higher. What would happen is every 20% of trash that was cleared of the dungeon would spawn a manifestation of Pride ad. This means you have a maximum of 5 throughout your entire run. When the ad spawns, it deals some ramping damage to your group and can be slowly brought down. And when slain, it gives you the Prideful buff. This increases your damage by 30%, movement speed by 60%, and restores 5% mana per second for 60 seconds. Generally, it sounds super fun to toy around with, creating very unique routes to perfectly time the spawn of the Prideful ad to utilize the damage buff. However, Prideful begins to show its cracks in the method of its spawning. If you make even the smallest mistake in the trash percentages as you progress the dungeon, it can very well cost you the key, as the keystones were tuned around the idea of you having this affix to aid you. Your hunter could accidentally pull an extra mob as you plan to have Prideful spawn before Tyrannical Hakar in Mythic 15, and it just demolishes your required damage to bring down such tough foes. It's super frustrating for the tank player involved, as the route they have can be completely hit or miss, and they need to execute it perfectly to have effective usage. On top of this, eventually when you hit much higher keystone levels, this affix was just straight up not worth getting. The ad that would spawn would have about 30% of a boss's health, and it would take far too long to bring down, and you'd likely die from the ramping damage it does. It wasn't unheard of at the time to get the ad to spawn and then just completely ignore it and let it reset, pulling the rest of the dungeon without the aid of the buff. At least with Thundering, you didn't have to actively change things and just got a damage buff for being in combat for an extended period. It wasn't impossible to recover from a bad pull of a percent if you were hyper aware of how much each mob was worth, but that gets to a very high skill level and memory that not every player is going to obtain. Basically, if your group understood your route and played it perfectly, Prideful could be super fun, but even the smallest mistake was punishing, primarily in pug groups. So it gets placed at number 4, running up a bronze medal for our next entry. And at number 3, we have an actually deadly combination of affixes, Teeming and Skittish. To start off, Teeming was a level 4 affix that would spawn additional trash mobs throughout the entirety of a dungeon. Additionally, the percentage required to complete the dungeon is increased to accommodate for the extra mobs taking place. The Teeming affix would spawn extra mobs in already dangerous packs, usually duplicates of ones already there, and sometimes completely new trash packs altogether. This is already pretty problematic, as modern Mythic Plus is entirely built around a person's cooldowns and knowing how much is safe and unsafe to pull. When you add extra mobs, it really delays the time to get to the next pack and makes you overcommit resources when you normally would not have. Skittish, however, was a level 7 affix that when combined with Teeming, it would simply cause the threat generated by tanks to be far less than it normally is, and risk DPS players taking aggro and killing themselves from playing too well. To be specific, a tank would be generating 80% less aggro than normally are, meaning your groups would either have to just sit and wait for the tank to build aggro before everyone else is allowed to engage, or stop their DPS mid-pull. This was nerfed somewhat, making the threat reduction 75% instead of 80% in patch 7.2 of Legion. But regardless, you have to be extra careful. Now, in an environment where you need to be going fast and the game is literally just telling you to stop what you're doing to not get you killed, literally no party involved in that is having fun. It made having hunters and rogues better those weeks with the addition of misdirection and tricks of the trade on the tanks. But having to manage aggro is literally never a fun task. It's why repeatedly when classes are doing too much damage or a tank too little, Blizzard will intervene and buff the threat generation of their classes dramatically. Having to tell your DPS to hold their cooldowns for the sake of their tank and their very lives could be an entry on its own. But when you realize these two affixes were able to be together, you may have just skipped doing dungeons altogether then. Basically, not only are you trying to hold off your damage to be as careful as possible, you also are going to be doing so upwards to 2 times as frequently because of the additional mobs taking place in the dungeon due to teaming. It brought dungeons to an absolute stall, and it's crazy to think they both existed in the game for so long, as they were both fully retired at the start of Shadowlands. This isn't to mention that healers also build aggro from using healing spells on injured allies. It wasn't uncommon for a healer to heal the tank attempting to build threat in the Skittish pack and just altogether steal aggro from them and get killed in the process. These two alone may deserve their own entry, but they absolutely ruin the enjoyment of keystones during their existence, because stopping and waiting in a timed event is never an ask for any level of player. Our second to last entry in this list is Bolstering added in Legion. During the start of this affix, when any trash mobs were to be killed, it would empower any nearby enemies you were currently in combat with. This would increase their health and damage by 20%, stacking up to 31 if you ever actually managed to get that high before dying. These stacks would not fall off, ever, and would just give the mobs a plain increase to everything they have. To any group, but especially tanks eating the melee attacks of the trash, you could have a mob with too many stacks that just ends up one-shotting you because of how it's scaled. The only actual counterplay to this affix was to kill trash packs evenly so there's no damage buff if they all die at the same time. Regardless though, it made chain pulling much harder to pull off, if not impossible. Chain pulling is the act of pulling a pack, and as it nears death, you grab the next pack to never slow down your damage and just keep going. With Bolstering, this risks starting a brand new pack off with the damage and health increase as you engage, because of the last group dying as you did so. It will slow you down a bit, but this isn't what really makes Bolstering so frustrating. In patch 9.1.5, they gave Bolstering a 20-second cooldown when it was permanent, now allowing especially strong mobs to eventually lose the buff they've gained, a stack at a time. In patch 10.1 of Dragonflight, Bolstering was changed to no longer buff the health of trash packs, making it just damage now. The health before this change certainly made packs take longer, just because it was basically healing each mob for 15%, depending on their current HP when you kill things around them. It's especially problematic in high density dungeons such as Freehold or Everbloom, where no matter how careful you are, there are tons of mobs to be pulled per pack, and it will make the last living one do ridiculous damage. No one has fun trying to play the game and then just getting one shot by the last mob of a pack in a scenario where pulling big is the fun portion. If you put this with Fortified during the week, you may as well not even attempt Keystones for the week if you're thinking about pushing them to a higher level. It's genuinely a negative experience for your dungeon group as a whole, and depending on what class your tank is, you may not see them until Bolstering is out of rotation again, because charging into a pack and down at the end of it, despite using cooldowns to survive, is a terrible feeling. So it's found as the second worst affix to exist in WoW, which is insane because it is still in rotation. Boo, I'm from the future.
OMG, are you me from the future?
No, I'm just from the future.
Oh, well, can I help you?
Yes, on June 14th, something amazing is going to happen.
Oh, is that when I meet my future wife? Or maybe land my dream job?
Even better, it's when the new VTuber Corp started by the Duologs is launched, and it takes the world by storm.
What's a VTuber Corp?
Oh, it's kind of like a talent agency where they hire on talented streamers and take a cut of their earnings in order to hire managers, editors, set up whatever merch they want, and organize conventional appearances for them.
That sounds like a scam. Why would a streamer want to sign up for that when they can do it themselves?
Because the logistics behind doing all that extra stuff is a huge pain in the butt, and they'd rather just focus on streaming.
Oh, I guess that makes sense. So are the ones from Glitch Stars any good?
Well, you'll need to see for yourself on June 14th. Just click the link in the video description and watch. You pay for the whole seat, but you'll only need the edge.
So you have to pay for it?
No, it's free. That's just the saying. Finishing list off number 1 is Overflowing. This affix was added with the Birth of Mythic Plus in Legion as a level 7 affix. Basically, what it did was any healing you did to your group that was considered an overheal, meaning healing done after they already hit max health, the target who received the heal is instead converted into a heal absorption effect. The healing absorbs are an effect that stack on top of someone's already existing health, and any health given to them, it is first given to the absorb before they are healed for the actual health percentage. So if you healed someone to full but overshot a little bit, you would then have a healing absorb that you have to remove, causing you to heal even more. What makes this affix so bad is that you could remove the healing absorb and then literally just reapply it again, because you were given the target healing to remove it in the first place. It's almost infinite in duration because of your attempts to actually get rid of the absorb. It was a healer's worst nightmare, and when an affix is made that just completely messes with the healer, it leaves everyone stressed out. The only viable way to play around this affix was to intentionally leave your party members injured, so you wouldn't risk healing them too much and apply the absorb. Imagine being a paladin and using Lay on Hands to save yourself, but now you have a huge healing absorb effect that punishes you for staying alive. You could literally use the defensive to handle the amount of incoming damage from a boss or trash pack, and then make your healer have to heal more because you gave yourself the absorb. This was super bad for Restoration Druids, as their entire kit revolves around HOTS. Once the heal is applied, you can't effectively remove it, really, and it could bring a person to full health and then apply the healing absorption just because they're playing their class optimally. To intentionally leave your group at a hindrance was super risky, as a boss could do their next set of mechanics and get your DPS or even tank killed just because you didn't want to have to deal with reapplying effects of overflow. It actually was one of the quickest affixes to get removed from the game, not even making it to the final patch of Legion, and getting removed in the Tomb of Sargeras patch 7.2. So, in summary, if you healed, you probably applied the overflow effects accidentally just for healing someone to max, like you're supposed to, and be punished for it, which leads us to be number 1, as, again, no one would or did enjoy this presence. This completes our list. Affixes are generally never fun to handle Mythic Plus because no one has actually sat down and said, man, I can't wait for Sanguine this week, it's super fun. So here we are. Are there any affixes you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? Please let us know down in the comments below.